how good is a religious body at getting scientific advice? And how does it get scientific advice? We'll have a look at how the Catholic Church is struggling to get scientific advice on climate. The Catholic Church started to grapple with climate problems after the Renaissance, as men started to change ideas about the universe, whether the sun was in the middle of the solar system, what paths did the planets take. And in that revolution of science, the church had a lot of difficulty. The first body that was set up to provide some sort of independent advice was called the Academy of the Lynxes. A prince, Federico Sisi, in 1603 set up this academy, and the symbols were the lynx and the eagle. The scientist was to be an eagle with good eyes, who described what he saw, who didn't look to theology or philosophy or some long-term biases that could have been held. He looked carefully and tried to describe without fear or favour what he saw. Unfortunately, that Academy of the Lynxes didn't survive after Sisi's death. It did try to defend Galileo, and at one stage Galileo was president of that academy. In the 1800s, around 1847, Pius IX resurrected the Academy of the New Lynxes, and it sort of struggled on, and that century was quite a century of change in scientific thought until the early 20th century, where it sort of morphed into an Italian Academy of Science. Then in the 1930s, Pope Pius IX set up a strict Pontifical Academy of Sciences. A headquarters was found at this beautiful building in the Vatican Gardens, and scientists who were top in their field in the world were invited to be members. Membership was not restricted to Catholics, it was not based on religion. Scientists such as Rutherford and Bohr, who were experts in unravelling the nature of our atom, Einstein, the theory of relativity, Stephen Hawking, a great physicist today, and the nature of black holes, etc. These have been members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Another great man who advised the church about science was Cardinal Newman in the 1850s. He wrote a book about what a university should be, and this was for the Irish church that was looking up to set a Catholic university in Dublin. And his advice was a scientist must use the peculiarities of his discipline, not to go out of that discipline, not to look at the theology department or the philosophy department, and not to worry if his ideas clashed with theologians or philosophers. And Newman also said we shouldn't worry whether the scientists in this department are atheists or Catholics or whatever. He said the great Baron von Humboldt, who was the world expert on oceanography at the time in Germany, he would adorn such a department. So there is a precedent there in the church, the Catholic Church, of looking for good, objective scientific advice. So what's it done at the moment with regard to climate? Well, at the moment, the main scientific advisor to the Vatican on climate comes from a German climate institute, the Potsdam Institute on Climate Impacts. The scientist's name, Hans Joachim Schellnhuber. The Potsdam Institute employs 400 people. It's funded by the German government, and it looks at tipping points that could tip the world out of balance, that could tip the climate out of balance. And Schellnhuber himself, in his original or early work, was a physicist who looked at tipping points in climate systems. Well, what advice are they providing? Schellnhuber is advising the pontiff that there are many tipping points in the climate system at the moment that could all go out of phase and cause severe problems for the human race. This is a rather convoluted advice because non-linear systems such as climate have lots of checks and balances. And the more checks and balances a system has, even though it's hard to predict exactly what happens, the more stable it is. What happens in a non-linear system is that all the reactions can take place up to certain boundaries, and when one gets near these boundaries, it bounces away from them. So non-linear systems can be incredibly stable. Look at our human body. It adjusts to heat, to cold. It fights off disease. It has all these reactions to keep a certain stability, and there are tipping points. So is Schellnhuber right? Let's look at his other tipping points that could shift our Mother Earth into dire straits and shift mankind into dire trouble. Well, one of the first things in the Potsdam Institute that they stressed to the pontiff is that sea levels could go up dramatically, and millions of people on the Earth who live near coastlines, the infrastructure will be under threat and their lives will be under threat, and it will be incredibly disruptive to mankind. The only trouble with this argument is that there's a sleight of hand in it. In 1990, the first report to the International Panel on Climate Change, the first report on sea level, looked at all the tide gauges around the world and said there's been no acceleration of sea level in the last 100 years. In other words, it's gone up at 15 centimetres a century, which is a steady rate. It's not steepening, it's not getting faster and faster. And in 1995, the IPC report then, the second report, again said tide gauge data indicates no acceleration of sea level. In 2011, the US Army Corps of Engineers, which is a world-famous body, looked at tide gauges in the Americas, the European coast, and Australasia to get a Southern Hemisphere database, which they got from the CSIRO in Australia. And they said again, there's been no acceleration of sea level in the last 120 years. And as a matter of fact, in the last 30 years, it could have slowed down a bit. And then in 2016, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association of the United States gave a report showing 200 tide gauges in America, and then some in the Atlantic Ocean and some in the Pacific Ocean on islands, and said, again, there's been no acceleration of sea level in the last 120 years. But how can Schellnhuber's group then say to the pontiff, sea level is accelerating, we're under danger from sea level? Well, the sleight of hand is pretty easy because in the 90s, NASA put up a satellite, and the satellite readings over Sydney are 3 times the tide gauges there, and over the German coast twice, and the satellite's been an embarrassment to NASA. NASA realised that this satellite system needs to be replaced. NASA has made a submission to the US Congress for a new system called GRASS, but can't get the money to do so. So we're looking at one method that is in its infant stages that isn't working properly, and reliable tide gauges that can be more easily analysed because they have a long history, and some of them have been very well constructed. But if you then decide to jump from the steady satellite data and then in the 1990s jump 3 times to the satellite data, you can then extrapolate that and get very high sea levels and say the human race is under threat. So this is not making Schellnhuber's group look very good. Schellnhuber also has been quite famous throughout the world of warning the world that we can't afford to warm more than 2 degrees Celsius. It's a sort of a barrier. Beyond that, we could be in a tipping point. Well, that's rather strange. I had a look at an area south of Sydney, 300 k's south in Australia. Now we know that 7,000 years ago there were temperate rainforests down there. So I said, wait a minute, let's warm that area up so it is to the equivalent climate that it was about 7,000 years ago. There's enough data around to do that. Well, when we do that, the summer minimum increases by 5 degrees. The winter minimum temperature increases by 7 degrees. And the maximum average temperature in winter and the maximum average temperature in summer increases by over 2 degrees. So how can 2 degrees be catastrophic? That's a very simple exercise. Maria wouldn't be that much off. That place wouldn't be that far off. It wouldn't be worse off. But it would have a different climate. And if you went further south, some of the changes would be even more dramatic. So what meaning has this 2 Celsius? And if we go back into other periods in Earth's history, the average temperature of the Earth was much warmer than 2 degrees. So this is not unprecedented. And to give this advice to the pod and say, listen, we've got to do something because things are pretty bad. And if we go 2 degrees Celsius, that could be catastrophic. That argument looks to be rather enthusiastic. It doesn't look to be consistent with good historical data. And then Schellnhuber, in a recent talk to the Pontifical Academy, said, look, we've got to act. Things are happening now. This is already happening. We're on the verge of a disaster. The weather's getting worse. Storms are getting more frequent. Well, what's the data say? Well, if you go to the number of hurricanes and the severity of hurricanes hitting the eastern side of the United States in the last 150 years, there's been no change of frequency. The population in Florida in 1900 was 5 million. Today, 23 million. So if you have a hurricane, there's going to be a lot more deaths. There's going to be a lot more infrastructure damage. But that doesn't mean to say the storms have got worse. And then there is another index that is kelped, and that is a wind intensity index in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere tropics of the severest winds every 6 hours. Now that's been going for 40 years. It's just got ups and downs. There's no trend, as CO2's been going up all the time, of the wind intensity index going up. And in 2015, the Prime Minister's Award for Science in Australia was to a scientist who'd showed that winds had been dropping in velocity in the interior of the Australian continent for the last 30 years. So this severe weather scare, and to say things are happening already and we've got to be on our guard and we've got to act, that is an exaggeration. That is just simply misleading. Then, of course, Schellnhuber has explained to the Pontifical Academy that methane could be catastrophically released in the Arctic. Now, methane is trapped in an ice-like substance called methyl hydrate, and it's in the permafrost of the Arctic, and it's also in the ocean floor in the Northern Ocean. The deposits are absolutely huge. Now, as the Arctic warms, which it is, parts of that permafrost melt, and then near the surface, that methane releases and leaves a crater. So if this warming keeps going, and it could, there's going to be a pockmarked landscape in some areas of the Arctic. But only 1% of the methane methyl hydrate that's around is actually on land. Most of it's under the ocean. The world expert in this area is a Dr. Ruppel. She works for the United States Geological Survey, and she has commented that even if the world kept warming for the next 1,000 years, the warmth wouldn't be enough to lead to a catastrophic release of methane. She points out that the ocean floor, the water down there is extremely cold. And even if you warm the upper ocean, to get that warmth down to the bottom, which is near freezing, it's virtually impossible to have any significant warmth that can then permeate down into the sediments and release significant quantities of methane. So this is an unholy scare, but experts in this area say that it's a false scare. And then, of course, Schellnhuber has pointed out, and there's lots of talk about this, because every time we see an iceberg floating in the Southern Ocean or an ice shelf disintegrating and leaving a big iceberg floating, that the Antarctic ice sheets are in danger and the Greenland ice sheet are in danger. Well, again, some of the arguments don't make sense. An argument was put to the Pontifical Academy that the Ross Ice Shelf and the Rhine Ice Shelf, which are in the ocean, partly sitting on the ocean floor and partly floating, are sort of like corks in a bottle holding the big ice sheets back. But the ice sheets are hundreds of times bigger than these little ice shelves. And that argument was floated, 45 years ago and thrown out? And here it is being resurrected to scare people? I'm afraid that the Pontiff is not getting good advice. The Pontiff is getting scary advice. And this type of scientific activism is very typical of enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is a gift. To be enthusiastic, often you get things done. But sometimes if people become too enthusiastic, they're willing to use any argument to justify their cause, to achieve their aims. And if they think that something catastrophic could be happening, they can be prepared to tell a few little lies on the way, because what they say is, look, there's nothing wrong with an odd lie or exaggeration because our ultimate cause is correct. After all, we're here to save the earth. Mankind's under threat. The only way to shake up lethargic human beings is to scare the living daylights out of them. So this is the type of advice the Pontiff has been getting, and Cardinal Turkson, who's been heading this particular section of the Vatican. One hopes that there's enough wisdom in the Church and some better knowledge of the nature of human nature itself to see through this charade and to realise that once people say, look, there isn't any time for argument, we've got to act now, to say, well, wait a minute, this type of attitude is really saying that what we're saying is not open to scrutiny. We don't want our ideas to be scrutinised. So really what we're saying, quite bluntly, and actually the same applies to the Royal Academy in England, that's had similar problems but not on the same scale, is that the Pontiff deserves to get good scientific advice. And really, the Pontiff really needs to be open to different advisors and to start changing advisors, because what's happening now could be very dangerous. An enthusiast gone wrong can eventually end up causing the opposite effect to what is intended. If Schellnhuber and this Potsdam Institute are scaring us into quickly putting up more and more wind farms and spending billions to do this, then less money is being put into research to develop good alternative energy technology. So the very effect that we want to eventually get rid of our dependence particularly on coal and the digging up of agricultural land, or land that could become agricultural, and a substance that can release a lot of pollution into the air, the very thing that we want to do to replace coal is being thwarted by wasting all this money, by putting some countries into more and more debt, by increasing the unemployment of the young through this panic that requires subsidies. The more and more we do this, the situation, we're causing the opposite of what's intended. So in short, let's pray that the Pontiff seeks better advice on climate.